Welcome to the Lyceum Institute Colloquium Series. These colloquia, comprising a pre-recorded lecture and live question and answer session, invite thinkers of all kinds to challenge us with their insights and understanding. This lecture, presented by Brian Jones, PhD candidate at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, titled The Practice of Philosophy in a Time of Loneliness, invites us to reflect upon the status and nature of our liberal democratic order and the ways in which its fragility has been exposed through the crisis of the pandemic and the governmental responses thereto, as well as the growing tension between the public and the government.
Well, greetings and welcome to everyone in the Lyceum community. Wanted to first, before the lecture, begin by thanking Dr. Kempel for the invitation to be able to speak to all of you. And I know that this is a great community and it's very pertinent to our topic tonight, just the very setup of the Lyceum, that we are a community of persons seeking the truth, and that we are looking to practice really the activity of philosophizing together. And so I think the very existence of the Lyceum and the kind of the framework that Dr. Kempel has in mind in putting this all together, I think connects very well to our topic tonight. And so hopefully you enjoy listening to this. I know I'll enjoy the opportunity to deliver this lecture, and if you don't enjoy it, then you just have to consider it as a sort of pre-Lenten penance for you. So the title of the lecture is The Practice of Philosophy in a Time of Loneliness. So let me begin. The COVID-19 pandemic and the destructive mitigation responses to it have certainly placed a heavy existential weight on democratic citizens. The social, political, and economic chaos of the past 2 years has been profoundly disorienting. In the midst of such an unprecedented response, we are right to wonder about the very endurance of our modern liberal democratic regimes. In Philosophy of Democratic Government, the French Catholic political philosopher Yves Simon argued why modern democracies have a struggle, a sort of instability to them. For Simon, he says, quote, "Preserving principles is more difficult in democracy than in any other regime as a result of liberalism, which implies that the principles of society and what its end is are not above deliberation and must be thrown into the universal competition of opinions. This is the jeopardizing of the principles without which social life no longer has an end or form," end quote. The current crisis is not the result of the pandemic. Rather, the general Western response to the pandemic has exacerbated certain social and political conditions present prior to the arrival of the virus. The pandemic merely escalated an already existing form of disintegration. While there are many features of this present crisis, one that is most acutely felt and witnessed is a cultural condition which tends to incline towards thoughtlessness. So the aim of this lecture is to attend to certain contextual features of the present crisis of democratic life just referenced. In particular, we will consider the increasing challenges to thinking, especially within what the Swiss-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the age of non-objects. Following these considerations, we will conclude by exploring some of the partial possibilities of recovering the practice of philosophy. With every passing week, the conditions that we've just alluded to seem to only become increasingly visible. In particular, the Western response to the pandemic entailed a systematic attack to hide various aspects of the truth. This suppression comes primarily, although not exclusively, through a coordinated attack upon any counter-narrative which might argue the virus is not as worrisome as originally held. The jargon of scientific consensus has now become a useless and empty tool employed to demonize those who question apocalyptic narratives surrounding the virus. Nuance is forbidden, and any attempt to make clear distinctions and arguments necessitates public shaming and disrepute. The various social media monopolies have only continued to accelerate efforts to take down content that is deemed, quote, undemocratic. Deeply troubled by such coordinated manipulation by the federal government, public health bureaucrats, tech companies, and big corporations, many have turned to defending freedom of speech and thought. The most significant threat to the West, according to this line of argument, is that our speech is being censored, and that once this happens, totalitarianism is on the horizon. And while there is certainly something that is deeply true in this claim, the argument often overlooks a more insidious reality. The attempt to label such certain forms of speech or thought as undemocratic or as misinformation is not fundamentally about free speech. What we are witnessing is the direct annihilation of truth. With great precision, the late political philosopher Father James Shaw said, or reveals, the social and political trajectory of such a logic. To Shaw, he says, quote, "If the polity makes truth because nothing higher than it exists, then we lose our capacity to oppose any structure of the city except on the basis of another, more powerful will. Thus, nothing can strictly speaking be wrong with any polity as such, since its origin lies exclusively in will and political will dependent on no order outside itself. In this way, transcendence of whatever form has disappeared into politics," end quote. In Shaw's judgment, there is an intrinsic connection between the abolition of truth and the eclipse of transcendence. Once truth is put asunder, the void it leaves will be substituted by the gradual yet real totalizing power of politics. At a fundamental level, such a paradigm shift means that human praxis becomes supreme. Contemplative and speculative thought become increasingly difficult. And more than this, such thought seems unintelligible. Calling to mind Michael Hanby's astute observation, the manifestation of such a condition is perhaps best described in the following manner. Democratic citizens have become very good at doing things which we are almost entirely incapable of thinking through. This preliminary diagnosis is still incomplete, for it only partially reveals the insufficiency for calls related to freedom of speech and thought. A further exploration into a neglected feature of the context of what Alexis de Tocqueville calls the democratic age is still needed. In this vein, I will briefly turn to Tocqueville and his insights concerning the socio-historical nature of modern democratic life. There is no better description of Tocqueville's perceptive vision of democratic life than his primary distinction between the social conditions of aristocratic and democratic man. Tocqueville's description goes as follows, quote, "Aristocracy links everybody, from peasant to king in one long chain. Democracy breaks the chain. Each man is thereby thrown back on himself alone, and there is a danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart," end quote. For Tocqueville, what makes the modern democratic soul unique is that it is brought into this new world precisely as cut off. No longer is one's formative identity encompassed by family name or a particular geographic place. The experience of living in the democratic age entails being uprooted and unsettled, seeing the world generationally, wherein we could look forward envisioning our great-grandchildren and also remain connected to the past by living near our families, has reached its end. While it is certainly the case that every age and civilization must address the perennial human task of how to live together in this world, we cannot neglect Tocqueville's judgment with respect to the modern world, where he says that a new political science is needed for a world that is entirely new. There is a profound and crippling feature of this new socio-historical context. Tocqueville illuminates this existential angst by portraying the democratic citizen as one looking over the ruins of a bygone world and celebrating its end. However, filled with an almost crippling fear of what lay ahead, democratic man cannot muster the courage to look forward at the new world not yet made. What is it that makes this turn to an unmade world so terrifying? In short, it is the stripping away of those various unchosen identities that are a fundamental component of being human. As the associations of civil society continually wither away, citizens live in a condition whereby the gap between them and the state only further increases. Churches, families, and neighborhoods become undermined by an administrative state apparatus that slowly and softly fills the void once bolstered by the various forms of associational life. You're going to have to forgive me for pausing while I drink my coffee. In referring to Tocqueville, we might be better equipped to illuminate the context of the democratic age and the specific challenge of our subject related to the activity of philosophizing. As noted above, the socio-historical shift that gave rise to the social conditions of equality also had a hidden form of darkness looming under the surface. More than anything else, the greatest threat to democratic life for Tocqueville would not be some type of populism, be it from the political left or the right. Rather, the most abiding threat for the democratic soul would be loneliness, wherein the democratic citizen becomes shut up in the solitude of his own heart. Now, there are two components to this loneliness that are worth exploring further. The first is what I would consider to be an epistemological solipsism, and the second is more existential in nature. It is important to remember how Tocqueville sees the democratic soul. He says the democratic soul is a Cartesian without ever having read a word of Descartes. What exactly does this mean? In one respect, Americans are convinced to mistrust the judgment of others and to seek the light of truth nowhere but in their own understandings. As a result, everyone then attempts to be his own sufficient guide and makes it his boast to form his own opinions on all subjects. Men are no longer bound together by ideas, but by interests. And it would seem as if human opinions were reduced to a sort of intellectual dust, scattered on every side, unable to collect, unable to cohere. 3 points need further elaboration in light of what Tocqueville just said. First, there is a shift in the locus of authority. Truth is not something received from a trusted authority or a particular tradition. Instead, truth is something that no longer seems to need the aid and assistance of others. One does not come to discover what is true, but now becomes the standard or arbiter of truth. Second, stemming directly from this shift is the loss of the communal character of human inquiry. The universal and transcendent nature of ideas gives way to interests. Interests are private and subjective, and yet something that I can still rightfully claim as my own. What constitutes an opinion versus a fact will become muddled, and the gap between what seems to be the case and what is actually so will evaporate. Finally, although citizens will gleefully raise up their opinions as knowledge, they will nonetheless experience the uneasiness of the supposed certitude. Lurking in the backdrop is our cognizance that we seem unable to put it all together into an intelligible and coherent framework. We may even call into question things that are self-evident and wonder even if what is obviously true may in fact be simply an appearance. According to Tocqueville, citizens would tend to oscillate between the poles of self-assurance of their own intellectual judgments and trepidation in recognizing how unfounded these certitudes actually are. The epistemological character of this condition shows its connection to the existential element of loneliness at this point, wherein we witness a solipsistic inward turn. The turn into the self, that is the defining trait of loneliness, is felt and experienced as profoundly debilitating. In this, we come face to face with the crippling sadness of meaninglessness, the social and psychological impact of being cut off, devoid of a familial, religious, or civic identity as a robust form, is naturally unsatisfying. And this loneliness also opens a door to various voids filled by collectivism. Traditional identities have been thrown off as oppressive, but the pain of one's existential vacuum will more than likely lead to the creation of new ones. And here, as I just mentioned, or as I've alluded to, identity politics segues nicely onto the scene. Hannah Arendt spoke precisely to this concern and the manner in which loneliness in the 20th century was fertile soil for totalitarianism. Arendt says, quote, "What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century," end quote. Arendt was careful to draw a distinction between solitude and loneliness. Solitude was a kind of reflective stance towards existence and evoked a kind of existential wonder. Solitude was a lens through which we come to see the world more clearly as it is. In a certain respect, solitude is a necessary prerequisite to philosophize well. As an aside, two good books on this are Raymond Kethledge's book, Lead Yourself First, Inspiring Leadership Through Solitude, and pretty much any work written by the computer science professor at Georgetown, Cal Newport. He wrote Deep Work in 2016, and then that was followed up by Digital Minimalism, and then A World Without Email. And in different ways, these works highlight the central need for human beings to cultivate a life of solitude. Loneliness, on the other hand, in comparison to solitude, is an inward turn that barricades. We go inward not for the purpose of discovering and seeing reality and ourselves in their wholeness, think of St. Augustine. Instead, we dive into ourselves out of both fear and pride. We become unable to think and simultaneously are then disconnected from others and ourselves. Knowledge is reduced to opinion, and groupthink and an ever-increasing government presence become the only means of salvation. Tocqueville paints an astute picture of what this looks like. Democratic citizens may come to see themselves as greater than kings, yet less than men. Sorry, quick coffee drink. Continuing this Tocquevillian tradition has been the more recent work of the Swiss-German philosopher Byung-Chul Han. Han contends that we no longer live in an age of objects, but in an age of information. In the age of information, or what Han calls non-objects, nothing is stable. As the digital world continues to stamp out all forms, we become increasingly reduced to information consumers. For Hahn, as objects disappear, persons lose their ability to attach to real things, and thus eventually lose the capacity for memory. The constant presence of information makes us numb and inattentive to its dehumanizing effects. Hahn observes that, quote, information has very little currency. Due to its temporal instability, it fragments perception. It throws us into a continued frenzy of topicality. Hence, it is impossible to linger on information. That's how it differs from objects. Information puts the cognitive system itself into a state of anxiety. We encounter information with the suspicion that it could just as easily be something else. And it is accompanied by distrust and strengthens the contingency experience. And information makes time-consuming cognitive practices such as experience, memory, or perception disappear, end quote. Stories and narratives in the age of information become replaced by technological devices that slowly but gradually induce a sort of submission. In Aristotelian terms, the basis of knowledge begins in sensation and moves through the cognitive states of memory and experience. What our knowledge concerns is real things, specifically their natures or essences. And so through Hahn's lens, we arrive at a rather unsettling diagnosis. The loss of a world of objects and forms has transformed to a disconnected abstraction of data and information. This breeds heightened levels of instability and loneliness, nudging us to turn inward into ourselves. By consuming unending quantities of information, we can have a temporary elation of being greater than kings but less than men. The Notre Dame political philosopher Patrick Deneen offers a good summary of the judgment that I have just made. Describing the students that he has taught over the years at Princeton and Notre Dame, Deneen contends that the majority of his students fit the description of a res idiotica. Deneen offers an unsettling image of his students, which is worth quoting here at length. Deneen says, quote, "My students are know-nothings. They are exceedingly nice and pleasant, trustworthy, mostly honest, and utterly decent. But their minds are largely empty, devoid of any substantial knowledge that might be the fruits of an education in an inheritance and a gift of a previous generation. My students are the fruits of a long-standing project to liberate all humans from the accidents of birth and circumstance and to make a self-making humanity," end quote. In this account, thoughtlessness and the void of substantial knowledge are not merely accidental, but there's something about the conditions of democratic life, as we have thus described, that seem likely to produce such effects. Let us not, however, miss something else going on beneath the surface of our increasingly despotic regimes. Perhaps it is right to say that we are witnessing at some level a robust and uniquely democratic push against what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. There do appear to be signs of philosophic life, wherein liberal democracy and politics can come to be seen as lacking the capacity for exhausting the totality of human flourishing. There is real vitality when citizens have the opportunity to wonder about their paradigms of truth. Hence, something so good about the Lyceum Institute. Thinking or philosophizing as a tradition practice calls to mind the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre and his notion of tradition-constituted inquiry. For MacIntyre, all forms of inquiry and knowledge presuppose and are grounded in a particular intellectual tradition. Our home life, education, and civic relationships entail a particular worldview that's contextualized within a given tradition. This community is central for thinking, a practice that always takes place within an inherited conversation. To speak of thinking as an inherited practice places before us a fundamental component of our exploration. We could put this said feature into the form of a perplexing question. What is the standard by which our traditions are judged? The standard or paradigm by which we judge our traditions ought to be truth. The reason why one would accept or reject a particular tradition, hopefully, is because the tradition points towards or away from what is true. In recovering thinking as a practice, we can come to see that the goal of a given tradition is not that we simply prefer it or that it is the one held by a particular thinker. Rather, the tradition guides one towards a truthful account of reality and human flourishing. Thus, a tradition of inquiry is judged as good to the degree in which it guides its practitioners in understanding reality as it actually is, and recognizing that tradition is for the sake of helping human beings to flourish precisely as human beings. A tradition, then, could be rightly considered along the lines of what the philosopher-mechanic Matthew Crawford calls a jig. A jig is a device or procedure that guides a repeated action by constraining the environment in such a way as to make the action go smoothly, the same each time, without his having to think about it. The same idea seems relevant when conceiving tradition as a type of intellectual jig. It provides a real type of liberty through its particular intellectual constraint, guiding one to do a specific activity well. In this case, it is the activity of thinking or philosophizing. Thus, what tradition provides is a structure, a setup for thinking well. This practice is not equivalent to today what would be called critical thinking. As mentioned before, critical thinking is worth defending, but it tends to de-emphasize this most fundamental aspect of thinking in favor of dismantling. That work is sometimes necessary, but the practice of thought must begin in gratitude. As Heidegger puts it, Denken ist Danken. The goal of this practice is to align oneself with what is true. A tradition frees a person to become excellent, to flourish in thinking and acting well as a human being. In connection with this is a second component of recovering thinking as a practice. A practice presupposes and cultivates a specific kind of relationship between the teacher and the student. We could refer to this relationship as between a master and his apprentice. These very terms indicate who possesses the relevant skill to accomplish his work in an effortless flow. While the teacher does guide students in examining a particular tradition, the practice of thinking still entails inviting the learner or the student to enter into a perennial conversation about the deepest questions of human existence. Again, insert here another plug for the Lyceum. Through cultivating philosophy or thinking in this way, the teacher can reveal that both the master and the apprentice are judged by the same reality. If you want to be a good carpenter or electrician, you must allow the intellectual judgment that the true order of reality is the standard by which you may make something that is good, that works. What constitutes a good chair or a good table is something independent of the will of both the master and the apprentice. One's own desires about what makes a thing good do not matter. The master craftsman will look at bad work and show why it is the case. The wisdom of others and the order of reality place a check upon the ego. Excuse me. One's desires cannot be the standard for determining what makes a particular craft or practice good. Such an affirmation should not lead us to think that judgment is merely the prerogative of the master. Fostering a relationship between the master and apprentice and understanding the connection of both to the order of reality gives the apprentice an opportunity to judge as well. Working within a tradition does not mean that the tradition is above critique. To say so is more readily made by the apprentice or the new practitioner than the master. This does not mean the undermining of tradition, but instead the real development within it. The Irish writer John Waters elucidates what is at stake here in seeing thinking as a practice. Waters says, quote, "To practice the craft is to enter into a relationship with the world that exists independently of oneself. To get better at something is to be drawn closer to an understanding of how the world works in practice. Such refreshing thoughts, rooted in the real, draw our attention to the point where the either-or of ideology gives way to a clearer set of perception arising from physical engagement with reality. Somewhere in there is the possibility of escaping also from the redundant idea that the good belongs exclusively to one side," end quote. Notice the connection that Waters makes. There's an intimate relationship between our worldview and the degree to which we regularly connect with the real. If the good is that which all of us are seeking, then we must be able to recognize that the reality of the good is not something that can be subsumed under the individual or collective will. In fact, just the opposite is the case. In some way, we must give ourselves over to discovering what is good, most especially at the theoretical and the practical level. By seeing what is good, forming practices and habits that are virtuous, we might be able to realize that this standard or paradigm of goodness is not our own. Thinking as a practice places a check upon the self. It offers us a way out of the condition that Deneen calls the res idiotica. This relationship between thought and its paradigm calls to mind Plato's Republic. Plato argued that the goal of life was to align oneself with a pattern, an eternal pattern whose origin was not man-made. Through this alignment alone could one's soul ever possibly be good. In classical political philosophy, the so-called democratic proclivity entails a bent towards those standards of justice disconnected from both truth and moderation. As the theologico-political thinker Leo Strauss argues, this is why Plato and Aristotle were hesitant to portray democracy as the best regime, since democratic citizens seem to have a stable opposition to philosophy. In Strauss's understanding, the perennial battle within democracy is that of continually attempting to create truth, only allowing certain pre-approved thoughts, feelings, or worldviews. Such a condition is one in which tyranny is less authoritarian in the strict sense, but which nevertheless looms on the horizon. In this light, the stark contrast between democracy and philosophy is made manifest. However, again, it does seem to be the case that democratic citizens are pushing back. Politics as a power grab is revealing itself for what it really is, namely an attempt to transform our lives based upon no other standard than some individual or collective will. Perhaps we are witnessing, at some level, among democratic citizens, a reinvigorating pursuit of what is true. We might simply describe this scenario as a hunt for truth. We should all be hopeful this is so, for the goal of philosophy is to grasp those eternal truths that cannot be subsumed under the direction or power of the city. If we can see the presence of philosophy as a principled bulwark against totalitarianism, then the possibility of thought is still alive in the democratic age. But without this practice, we will simply conform to the patterns of information and presentism, which encourages a jigless and traditionless form of thinking and living. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture, and I look forward to the opportunity to converse with you, to philosophize more during our question and answer session that is just around the corner. Thanks again for everyone for listening, and thanks again for the invitation from Dr. Kempel.